Sometimes the most life-changing moments happen when someone thinks no one is watching. The alert appeared on Ethan Carter's phone at exactly 8:17 p.m., a quiet chime cutting through the silence of his private office 40 stories above downtown Chicago. The billionaire CEO rarely paid attention to the automated security notifications from his penthouse across town. The system was designed to flag unusual movement, but most of the time it was just a housekeeper finishing late or the building staff checking a window sensor. Ethan glanced at the screen almost absent-mindedly while reviewing quarterly projections on his tablet. But something about the alert made him pause. Motion detected. Master bedroom. He frowned slightly. That was strange. The cleaning service was scheduled earlier in the afternoon, and the apartment should have been empty by now. Curious, he tapped the notification and the live camera feed quietly expanded across his screen. The image came into focus slowly, revealing the sleek interior of his penthouse bedroom, floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the glowing Chicago skyline and the soft lamplight inside the room. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then the door opened. A young woman stepped inside, carefully closing it behind her. Ethan straightened in his chair, his brow tightening with confusion. She wasn't anyone he recognized. She looked barely in her 20s, wearing a simple gray maintenance uniform and carrying a small cleaning tote. Her dark hair was slightly damp, strands clinging to her cheek as if she had just come in from the rain. For a moment she simply stood there, breathing slowly, as though grateful to be somewhere warm and quiet. Ethan assumed she must be part of the cleaning crew working overtime, but something about her posture caught his attention. She looked exhausted. Not lazy tired, but the kind of tired that came from too many long days stacked on top of each other. She set the cleaning supplies down near the dresser and rubbed her arms as if trying to warm herself. Outside the massive windows, rain streaked down the glass in thin silver lines. Even through the silent footage, Ethan could almost imagine the cold wind blowing across the lake. The young woman glanced around the room cautiously, clearly believing she was completely alone. Then she reached up and removed her damp work jacket, revealing a simple white t-shirt underneath. Ethan immediately looked away from the screen, his hand moving almost on instinct. He tapped the control panel and shut the camera feed off within seconds. The monitor returned to black. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, staring at the dark screen as if it might explain what had just happened. Whatever that moment had been, it wasn't something he felt comfortable witnessing. Privacy mattered to him more than most people realized, especially after years of living under constant media attention. But even after the screen went dark, something about the brief glimpse stayed in his mind. It wasn't the situation itself. It was the way she had been shivering slightly when she entered the room, like someone who had been standing outside too long in the rain. Ethan Carter had spent most of his life surrounded by people who moved with confidence and certainty. Boardrooms, investors, executives, everyone always seemed to know exactly where they belonged. But that young woman had walked into the penthouse like someone who had borrowed a world that didn't belong to her. And strangely, that was the moment Ethan Carter would later realize had quietly changed everything. The office was quiet again, but Ethan Carter could not return to the numbers on his screen. The quarterly reports still glowed across the tablet in front of him, rows of financial projections stretching into the billions. Yet his mind kept drifting back to the brief moment he had just shut off. The camera had only been active for a few seconds, maybe 3, maybe 4. Still, it was enough to leave an impression that refused to fade. Ethan rubbed his temple slowly and leaned back in the leather chair, staring across the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. Chicago shimmered below him in the rain, headlights moving through the streets like thin rivers of light. Usually the city felt predictable to him. Systems, schedules, contracts, strategies. Everything had structure. Everything made sense. But that unexpected alert from his penthouse had broken that rhythm in a way he did not quite understand. He reached for his phone again, hesitating for a moment before opening the security dashboard. The screen showed the system log in clean blue text. Camera disabled manually. 8:17 and 32 seconds. Motion detected. Master bedroom. Ethan exhaled quietly. He had turned the feed off almost instantly, the moment he realized the young woman thought she was alone. Even now, he felt certain that had been the right decision. But another detail kept replaying in his memory. When she first stepped into the room, she had hugged her arms tightly across herself, almost like someone trying to warm up after standing outside in freezing weather. It was early November, and the wind coming off Lake Michigan could cut through a jacket like it was nothing. He knew that feeling well. Chicago winters were not forgiving. For a moment, he considered reopening the camera feed just to confirm that everything in the apartment was normal. Then he stopped himself. The system had already been shut down for that room, and restarting it would defeat the entire reason he had turned it off in the first place. Privacy mattered, especially when someone clearly believed they were alone. Instead, he tapped another button and checked the building access log. The penthouse elevator had been used 20 minutes earlier with a temporary service pass. Cleaning staff. That made sense. The property management company handled the scheduling for maintenance and housekeeping, and Ethan rarely interfered with their routine. Still, curiosity lingered. He scrolled through the employee entry list until one name appeared beside the access code assigned to his unit. Olivia Hayes. Ethan studied the name for a moment, quietly repeating it in his head. He did not know why it caught his attention. Perhaps because it was the first real detail attached to the moment that had interrupted his evening. Downstairs in the quiet penthouse across the city, Olivia Hayes was likely finishing her cleaning shift, completely unaware that a silent alert had traveled across Chicago just minutes earlier. She probably believed the apartment belonged to someone she would never meet, some distant wealthy owner whose life existed far above her own world. Ethan closed the security dashboard and placed the phone on the desk again. Normally, that would have been the end of it. Another routine entry in a building system log. Another worker passing through a place she did not truly belong. But something about the way she had walked into the room stayed with him. Not confident, not careless, just quietly tired. And although Ethan Carter could not have explained why, a small part of him suddenly found himself wondering what kind of life existed outside the walls of his penthouse for someone like Olivia Hayes. Across the city, long after Ethan Carter closed the security dashboard, Olivia Hayes was finishing the last room of the penthouse, completely unaware that her name had just appeared on the phone of one of the most powerful men in Chicago. She moved quietly through the spacious apartment with a small cloth in her hand, wiping the glass surface of a coffee table that probably cost more than everything inside her tiny studio apartment combined. The penthouse was beautiful in a way that almost felt unreal. Tall windows framed the glowing skyline, soft lights reflected across polished marble floors, and every piece of furniture looked like it had been placed there with careful intention. Olivia had cleaned luxury apartments before, but this one always felt different. Not louder, not more extravagant, just calm, like a space designed for someone who valued silence more than attention. She finished the table and checked the small list on her phone that showed the rooms she still needed to complete. Kitchen counters done. Guest bathroom done. Living room almost finished. The bedroom had been the last space on the schedule, and thankfully it had not taken long. She had only stepped in there for a moment to set down her supplies and warm up after the cold rain outside. Even now she could still feel the chill in her fingers as she slipped her damp cleaning jacket back on. Chicago wind had a way of cutting through thin fabric no matter how many layers someone tried to wear. Olivia picked up her cleaning tote and walked into the kitchen to finish wiping the granite counters. Her reflection faintly appeared in the dark surface of the marble backsplash. 24 years old, dark hair tied loosely back, tired eyes that carried more responsibility than most people her age. She gave a small, quiet smile to herself, the kind people sometimes use just to stay motivated through another long shift. The cleaning company paid $15 an hour, which was enough to cover rent if she worked enough days each week. But Olivia also had another reason for pushing through the long hours. In the outer pocket of her tote bag sat a small worn sketchbook that she carried almost everywhere. During bus rides, lunch breaks, or quiet moments between jobs, she would fill the pages with drawings of city streets, coffee shops, strangers walking past bright storefront windows, and sometimes the Chicago skyline glowing at night just like it did now beyond the penthouse glass. One day she hoped those sketches might turn into something more than just pages hidden in a bag. Maybe a small art show. Maybe even a gallery someday, if life ever gave her that kind of chance. For now it was simply a dream she carried quietly between cleaning shifts and late bus rides home. Olivia turned off the kitchen light and walked back toward the entrance of the apartment, checking that everything looked exactly the way the property manager expected. Perfect lines, clean surfaces, no trace that anyone had been there at all. She slipped on her jacket fully, grabbed the tote bag, and paused one last time to look out across the massive windows at the glowing city below. For a brief second, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to wake up every morning to that view. Then she shook her head with a soft laugh and headed for the elevator, already thinking about the long bus ride waiting for her in the cold November rain. The rain had not stopped by the time Olivia Hayes stepped out of the bus nearly an hour later. Cold winds swept between the narrow Chicago apartment buildings, carrying the smell of wet pavement and distant traffic. She pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders and hurried down the dimly lit sidewalk toward the small brick building she called home. The place was nothing like the quiet luxury of the penthouse she had just cleaned. The hallway lights flickered slightly, the elevator had been broken for 3 months, and the narrow staircase creaked with every step. Still, it was hers. Apartment 3B sat at the end of the hallway, a tiny studio barely large enough for a bed, a small table, and a kitchenette that hummed constantly with the sound of an aging refrigerator. Olivia unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately feeling the quiet comfort of the familiar space. She set her cleaning tote beside the table and kicked off her damp shoes, rubbing her cold hands together as she walked toward the small electric heater by the window. Outside, the city continued glowing under the rain, but from this side of Chicago the skyline looked much farther away. Olivia turned on the heater and wrapped herself in a thick gray sweater. Draped over the back of her chair, the warmth slowly returned to her fingers. After a long moment, she reached into the outer pocket of her cleaning bag and pulled out the small worn sketchbook she carried everywhere. The edges of the cover were bent from years of being tucked into backpacks and tote bags, but the pages inside were filled with careful drawings that told quiet stories about the city around her. She flipped through the pages slowly. A street musician outside a subway station. A coffee shop window glowing on a snowy night. A couple holding umbrellas while crossing Michigan Avenue. Each drawing was simple but alive with small details most people never noticed. Olivia picked up a pencil and sat at the small table beside the window. From here, she could just barely see the distant outline of downtown buildings glowing beyond the rain clouds. She began sketching the skyline the way she had seen it earlier through the massive penthouse windows. The tall towers, the soft reflection of light on Lake Michigan, the quiet stillness that seemed to exist high above the noise of the streets. For a moment, the memory of that view made her smile. It felt like peeking into a completely different world, one where life moved slower and worries were smaller. After nearly 20 minutes, the drawing was finished. Olivia studied it thoughtfully, then closed the sketchbook and set it gently beside her bed. Tomorrow would be another long day. 2 morning cleaning jobs, followed by a 4-hour evening shift at a small cafe on Wabash Avenue. The routine rarely changed. Work, bus rides, late dinners, and quick sketches whenever time allowed. Across the city at that exact moment, Ethan Carter was still sitting in his office high above the glowing skyline Olivia had just drawn. The reports on his desk remained untouched. Instead, he found himself looking again at the single name that had appeared in the building access log earlier that evening. Olivia Hayes. He had met thousands of people during his years running Carter Dynamics, investors, executives, politicians, innovators from around the world. Yet somehow a quiet cleaning worker he had never even spoken to had managed to interrupt his thoughts for the entire evening. Ethan leaned back in his chair and glanced once more toward the rain streaking down his office windows. Somewhere out there in the enormous city below, the young woman who had unknowingly stepped into his penthouse was probably finishing her day like it was any other. Neither of them had any idea that a simple security alert lasting only a few seconds had just quietly connected 2 lives that had never been meant to cross. The next morning arrived gray and quiet, the kind of Chicago morning where the clouds seemed to sit low over the city as if the skyline itself were holding them in place. Olivia Hayes woke up to the soft buzzing of her alarm clock at 6:30, the same sound that started almost every day of her life. For a few seconds she stayed under the blanket, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside her apartment window and the distant rumble of the early train line passing through downtown. Then she sat up, tied her hair back, and reached for the small coffee maker on the narrow kitchen counter. The apartment smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans and graphite from the pencil she had used the night before. Her sketchbook still rested beside the bed where she had left it. She opened it for a moment, glancing at the drawing she had finished of the skyline glowing beyond the rain. The tall buildings looked calm in the sketch, peaceful in a way the real city rarely was. Olivia smiled quietly and closed the book again before slipping it into her bag. The day ahead was already scheduled down to the minute. 2 cleaning jobs in the morning, followed by a short break, and then the cafe shift that lasted until late evening. She pulled on her work jacket and stepped out into the cold hallway, already hearing the wind push against the building outside. Across the city, Ethan Carter had arrived at the headquarters of Carter Dynamics nearly an hour earlier than usual. The glass tower that housed his company stood tall along the Chicago River, its reflective windows catching the pale morning light. Inside the executive office floor, everything was quiet except for the soft clicking of keyboards and the distant hum of printers starting their daily routine. Ethan walked through the hallway with the same composed presence that had made him one of the most respected leaders in the technology industry. Employees greeted him politely as he passed, but most of them sensed when their CEO was deep in thought and chose not to interrupt. Inside his office, the city stretched endlessly beyond the windows. Yet Ethan's attention returned once again to something far smaller than business reports or investor meetings. He sat at his desk and opened the property management dashboard connected to his penthouse. The same name appeared again in the previous night's service record. Olivia Hayes. The cleaning company profile attached to the record included only basic details. Temporary staff member. Part-time schedule. Residential maintenance rotation across several luxury buildings in downtown Chicago. Ethan studied the information for a moment longer than necessary. Normally, he would not involve himself in something so minor. Building maintenance was handled by property management teams for a reason. But the thought returned again, the image of the young woman stepping into the quiet penthouse, rubbing her arms as if the cold had followed her inside. Ethan closed the tablet slowly and leaned back in his chair. There was no logical reason for him to think about her again. Yet curiosity had a strange way of moving quietly through even the most structured lives. Meanwhile, Olivia was already riding a crowded city bus heading toward her first cleaning job of the morning. She stood near the back holding the metal rail as the vehicle moved through traffic along Michigan Avenue. Outside the windows, the city was waking up, coffee shops opening their doors, office workers rushing toward subway stations, taxis sliding through intersections under the gray sky. Olivia looked out at the passing buildings with the same quiet observation she always carried, noticing the reflections of lights in the wet pavement and the patterns of people moving through the streets. Somewhere high above those same streets, in an office overlooking the river, Ethan Carter was finishing his morning coffee while unknowingly thinking about the same young woman riding that bus below. Neither of them realized that the simple security alert from the night before had started something neither schedule nor distance would easily erase. By late afternoon, the Chicago sky had turned a pale silver, the kind of quiet light that made the glass towers along the river shimmer like mirrors. Olivia Hayes stepped out of the second building on her cleaning route and checked the time on her phone. 4:22 in the afternoon. She had barely 40 minutes before her shift at the cafe began. The cold wind pushed against her jacket as she walked toward the bus stop, her cleaning totes swinging lightly at her side. It had already been a long day. 2 apartments cleaned, a quick sandwich eaten on the bus between jobs, and now another 4 hours serving coffee and pastries to the endless stream of evening customers downtown. Yet she did not complain. Hard work had become a normal rhythm in her life, something steady and dependable when many other things had not been. As the bus pulled up to the curb with a soft hiss of air brakes, Olivia stepped inside and found a seat near the window. The city passed by in moving reflections across the glass as the vehicle rolled through traffic toward Wabash Avenue. Her hand drifted absent-mindedly to the bag beside her where the small sketchbook rested safely between her work apron and a folded sweater. Even after years of carrying it everywhere, she still felt a quiet sense of comfort knowing it was there. A place where the world slowed down enough to be captured with a pencil. Across the city, inside the headquarters of Carter Dynamics, Ethan Carter was finishing a meeting with 2 senior executives discussing an upcoming technology launch. The presentation slides glowed on the conference room screen, filled with charts, market forecasts, and projected global growth. Normally, Ethan would have been fully focused on every detail. But today something kept interrupting the usual flow of his thoughts. As the meeting ended and the executives gathered their documents, Ethan returned to his office overlooking the Chicago River. He stood for a moment beside the tall windows, watching the afternoon traffic move slowly across the bridges below. Then he walked back to his desk and opened the property management system again. The penthouse cleaning schedule appeared on the screen with the same familiar list of service staff. Olivia Hayes was scheduled again for a maintenance rotation in his building later that week. Ethan stared at the entry quietly. He could not fully explain the decision forming in his mind, but it felt less like curiosity and more like unfinished awareness. The brief moment from the security alert had shown him only a small fragment of someone's life, yet somehow it felt incomplete to leave the story there. After a few seconds, he picked up the office phone and called the building management office connected to his residential property. When the receptionist answered, he spoke calmly, his voice steady and professional. He explained that he would be visiting the penthouse later in the week during a routine service window to review a few minor updates in the security system. It was not entirely untrue. The system had alerted him exactly as designed. But the real reason sat quietly beneath the explanation. Meanwhile, the bus Olivia was riding slowed to a stop near the bright storefront of the cafe where she worked evening shifts. She stepped off the bus and pulled her jacket tighter against the wind before walking toward the warm lights inside. The small bell above the cafe door chimed softly as she entered, greeted by the comforting smell of fresh coffee and baked bread. Olivia tied on her apron and stepped behind the counter, ready for another long evening serving customers who would likely never know her name. At that same moment, several miles away, Ethan Carter closed the property management dashboard and glanced once more at the name that had quietly stayed in his thoughts throughout the day. Olivia Hayes. In just a few days, their worlds were scheduled to cross in the same room again, although neither of them yet understood how much that simple meeting would begin to change everything. 2 days passed quietly before the scheduled service rotation returned to the penthouse tower overlooking the Chicago River. The morning air carried a sharp winter chill, and Olivia Hayes pulled her scarf tighter as she stepped off the city bus and walked toward the polished glass entrance of the building she had cleaned earlier that week. The lobby alone felt like stepping into a different world. Warm lighting reflected across marble floors. The scent of fresh lilies filled the air, and a quiet piano melody drifted softly from hidden speakers near the reception desk. Olivia signed in with the building concierge just as she always did, her name appearing briefly on the service log before she received the temporary elevator pass. For her, this building was simply another job location on a long list of addresses across the city. She had no reason to believe today would be any different. Meanwhile, several floors above the skyline, Ethan Carter stood near the tall windows of his penthouse watching the gray clouds roll slowly over Lake Michigan. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the heating system. Ethan rarely spent weekday mornings here, but today he had arrived early under the explanation of reviewing several security upgrades for the property. In truth, the system had been functioning perfectly. The alert from earlier that week had proven that. Yet he had chosen this exact service window for a reason he still had not fully explained even to himself. On the kitchen counter, a tablet displayed the building's service schedule. Olivia Hayes. 10:05 a.m. Maintenance cleaning rotation. Ethan checked the time again. 10:03. Down in the lobby, Olivia stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the top residential floor. The quiet hum of the lift carried her upward through the tower. She balanced the small cleaning tote against her hip while reviewing the task checklist on her phone. Living room surfaces, kitchen counters, bedroom dusting, bathroom fixtures. The routine never changed. When the elevator doors finally opened, she stepped into the quiet hallway and walked toward the familiar penthouse door at the end of the corridor. Everything looked exactly the same as before. Tall windows at the far end of the hallway revealed the river below, and the entire floor felt peaceful in the kind of way that only existed high above the busy streets of Chicago. Olivia knocked lightly out of habit before using the temporary service key to unlock the door. She expected the apartment to be empty just like every other time she had worked there. Inside the penthouse, Ethan Carter heard the soft click of the door opening from across the living room. For a brief moment, he remained standing near the windows, watching the quiet reflection of the city lights on the glass. Then he turned slowly as Olivia stepped inside, carrying her cleaning supplies. She took only 2 steps into the apartment before freezing in place. The tall man standing near the windows turned toward her calmly, dressed in a dark charcoal suit that reflected the pale morning light behind him. Olivia's eyes widened slightly as she realized the apartment was not empty at all. Ethan Carter studied her expression with the same quiet composure he carried into every boardroom negotiation. The same young woman from the security alert stood in front of him now, looking slightly surprised but still holding her cleaning tote carefully at her side. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the windows, the Chicago skyline stretched endlessly across the horizon, completely unaware that 2 lives from very different worlds had just crossed paths for the first time. For a moment, Olivia Hayes wondered if she had entered the wrong apartment. The man standing near the windows looked nothing like the residents she occasionally saw in the buildings where she worked. He carried a calm presence that seemed almost too composed, the kind of quiet authority that did not need to raise its voice to fill a room. The gray Chicago sky behind him reflected softly against the glass walls of the penthouse, outlining his silhouette against the city skyline. Olivia quickly straightened her posture, tightening her grip on the strap of her cleaning tote. "I am sorry," she said carefully, her voice polite but slightly uncertain. "I thought the apartment was empty. I can come back later if this is not a good time." Ethan Carter studied her for a brief moment before speaking, his expression calm and measured. Up close, he noticed the same details he had seen only briefly through the security alert earlier that week. The quiet tiredness in her eyes, the careful way she held herself like someone used to staying unnoticed in other people's spaces. Yet there was also something else there, something observant and thoughtful beneath the exhaustion. "No, it is fine," Ethan replied evenly. "You can continue with your work." Olivia nodded quickly, still slightly embarrassed by the unexpected encounter. She stepped further into the apartment and set her cleaning tote gently on the kitchen counter, trying to return to the routine she had followed dozens of times in other luxury homes across Chicago. But today the quiet penthouse felt different. It was no longer an empty space filled with expensive furniture and distant city views. Now the owner of that space was standing only a few feet away, watching calmly as she began wiping down the marble surfaces. For a few minutes the apartment remained silent except for the soft sound of a cleaning cloth moving across the countertop. Ethan walked slowly toward the kitchen area and poured himself a glass of water, careful not to interrupt her work. From this distance, he could see the small details more clearly. The worn edge of her jacket sleeves, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she worked, the quiet focus in her movements. Olivia finished the counter and reached into her tote to grab another cloth when something slipped from the side pocket and landed softly on the floor. A small sketchbook slid across the polished marble tiles. She froze for a moment before quickly kneeling to pick it up, but Ethan had already noticed the pages that briefly opened during the fall. A delicate pencil drawing of the Chicago skyline stretched across the paper, detailed and alive with careful shading. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "Did you draw that?" he asked. Olivia hesitated before nodding. "Yes," she answered quietly, brushing a small bit of dust from the cover as she stood up again. "Just something I do in my free time." Ethan held out his hand politely. "May I?" Olivia looked uncertain for a second before handing him the sketchbook. Ethan flipped through a few pages slowly, each drawing capturing small moments of the city that most people hurried past without noticing. Street corners glowing under rain, reflections of cafe lights in puddles, a quiet view of the skyline at night. He closed the sketchbook and handed it back with a thoughtful expression. "You have a good eye for detail," he said calmly. Olivia blinked slightly, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you," she replied softly, slipping the sketchbook back into her bag. Neither of them realized yet that the simple accident of that sketchbook falling onto the floor had just opened a door neither of them expected. Olivia Hayes returned to wiping the kitchen counter, but her mind was no longer focused entirely on the task. The quiet compliment still lingered in the air, unexpected in a place where she normally moved unnoticed. Most residents in luxury buildings barely looked at the cleaning staff, treating them like part of the furniture that quietly maintained the perfection of their homes. Yet Ethan Carter had studied her drawings as if they actually mattered. She kept her movements steady, rinsing the cloth in the sink and continuing her routine, but a small sense of curiosity had begun to form beneath her calm expression. Ethan leaned lightly against the kitchen island, watching the city through the tall windows while also observing the careful rhythm of her work. He had spent years in rooms filled with ambitious executives and brilliant engineers, people who constantly competed for attention and recognition. Olivia Hayes seemed to exist in the exact opposite world. She worked quietly, efficiently, never drawing attention to herself, yet somehow that quiet presence felt more genuine than most of the conversations he had in boardrooms. After a few minutes, Ethan spoke again, his tone conversational rather than formal. "How long have you been drawing the city like that?" Olivia glanced up slightly before answering. "Since I was a kid," she said. "Chicago has a lot of interesting corners if you pay attention. People usually rush past them." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Most people do rush," he replied. "It takes patience to notice details like that." Olivia returned to cleaning the kitchen sink, but the conversation had softened the awkwardness that had filled the room earlier. She felt a little less like an intruder and a little more like a person simply doing her job. A few minutes later, she moved toward the living room area, beginning the next part of her checklist. Ethan followed slowly, picking up the glass of water he had poured earlier. The spacious room looked even more impressive during the day. Sunlight pushed through the gray clouds outside, reflecting across the polished floors and highlighting the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the windows. Olivia dusted the shelves near the large bookshelf that lined the far wall. As she worked, Ethan noticed her pause briefly in front of one of the framed photographs sitting beside a collection of design awards. The photograph showed the Chicago skyline at sunrise, captured from nearly the same height as the penthouse windows. Olivia studied it quietly for a moment before returning to her work. "That view changes every hour," Ethan said calmly from across the room. Olivia turned slightly, surprised that he had noticed. "I believe that," she said. "The skyline never really looks the same twice." Ethan nodded again. For a brief second, both of them stood looking out toward the city beyond the glass walls. Thousands of people moved through the streets far below, each following their own routines without realizing how many unseen stories existed above and around them. Then Ethan spoke again, this time with quiet curiosity. "Do you ever show your drawings to anyone?" Olivia shook her head gently. "Not really," she admitted. "They are mostly just for me." Ethan studied her expression thoughtfully before answering. "Sometimes, the things people keep to themselves are the ones worth sharing the most." Olivia did not respond immediately. Instead, she turned back to her cleaning supplies, but the words stayed in her mind longer than she expected. Neither of them realized it yet, but the simple conversation unfolding inside the quiet penthouse was beginning to shift the distance between two lives that had once existed in completely different worlds. Olivia Hayes finished dusting the final shelf near the tall windows and stepped back to review the living room the way she always did before moving to the next task. Every surface looked exactly as it should, clean and orderly, the quiet perfection expected in a place like this. Yet the atmosphere in the penthouse no longer felt like the silent, empty space she had cleaned before. The presence of Ethan Carter had changed the rhythm of the room in a subtle way she could not quite explain. He stood near the windows again, looking out over the city as if the skyline itself were part of a conversation only he could hear. For a moment, Olivia considered simply continuing her work without speaking again, but curiosity quietly nudged her thoughts. Most people who owned apartments like this rarely stayed long enough to watch someone clean them. She moved toward the coffee table and carefully wiped the glass surface, then spoke in a polite but natural tone. "Do you live here full-time?" Ethan turned slightly, as if surprised by the question but not bothered by it. "Not exactly," he answered. "Most of my time is spent at the company office across the river." Olivia nodded, remembering the tall glass towers she passed every morning on the bus downtown. "That must be busy," she said. Ethan allowed a small smile to appear. Busy is a polite way to describe it. The conversation paused again, but the silence felt less uncomfortable than before. Olivia moved toward the wide windows to clean the thin line of dust that sometimes gathered along the frame. As she reached the glass, the entire Chicago skyline stretched in front of her once more, the tall buildings rising above the river like steel reflections against the clouds. Even after seeing the view several times, it still felt breathtaking. "You are lucky to see this every day," she said without thinking. Ethan followed her gaze toward the horizon. "Sometimes. I forget it is even there," he admitted quietly. Olivia looked at him briefly, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "How could someone forget a view like that?" she asked. Ethan rested one hand lightly on the edge of the window frame. When people spend most of their time looking at numbers and schedules, they start missing the details outside the glass. Olivia understood that feeling more than he probably expected. Her life was full of routines as well, early buses, long work hours, and constant schedules that rarely changed. Yet she had always tried to notice small moments anyway, the glow of streetlights on wet pavement, the quiet patterns of city life that inspired her sketches. "That is why I draw it," she said softly, gesturing toward the skyline. "So I remember to look." Ethan studied her for a moment, thoughtful again. The simplicity of that explanation carried more meaning than most conversations he heard during corporate meetings. Olivia returned to her supplies and began gathering the cloth she had used, preparing to finish the last room on her checklist. As she walked toward the hallway leading to the bedroom, Ethan spoke again, this time with a calm curiosity that felt almost deliberate. "Olivia," he said, using her name for the first time. She paused and turned back toward him. "Yes." Ethan met her eyes steadily. "Would you mind showing me one more of your drawings before you leave today?" The question surprised her enough that she hesitated for a second, but something in his expression suggested genuine interest rather than simple politeness. Slowly she reached into her bag and pulled out the small sketchbook once again, unaware that the simple request had just begun a moment neither of them would easily forget. Olivia Hayes held the sketchbook carefully in both hands for a moment, almost as if she were deciding whether it truly belonged in this quiet penthouse filled with polished marble and floor-to-ceiling glass. The pages inside had always lived quietly between bus rides and late nights in her small apartment, never meant to be examined by someone whose life looked so completely different from hers. Yet Ethan Carter's expression remained calm and patient, not demanding, simply waiting. Finally, she stepped closer and opened the sketchbook again, turning a few pages before stopping on a drawing she had finished only a few nights earlier. It showed the Chicago River just before sunset. The buildings reflected softly across the water while small boats moved quietly between the bridges. Ethan took the sketchbook gently, careful with the worn edges of the pages. For several seconds, he studied the drawing without speaking. Olivia watched his reaction cautiously, unsure what someone like him would see in a simple pencil sketch. To her surprise, Ethan did not glance at it quickly the way most people did. Instead, he looked closely, noticing the shading along the buildings, the way the water reflected the fading light, the tiny silhouettes of people walking across the bridge. "You captured the river at the exact moment it becomes quiet," he said thoughtfully. Olivia blinked slightly. That was precisely the moment she had tried to draw. "Most people do not notice that time of day," she replied softly. Ethan turned another page, revealing a sketch of a narrow street corner cafe glowing under rain. Another page showed commuters waiting at a bus stop beneath streetlights. Each drawing carried the same careful attention to details that others might overlook. Ethan finally closed the sketchbook and handed it back to her. "These are not just sketches," he said calmly. "They are observations." Olivia slipped the book back into her bag, still unsure how to respond to the compliment. "They are just something I do when I have time," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once, as if understanding more than she expected. "How much time do you get for that?" he asked. Olivia considered the question honestly. "Not much," she admitted with a small smile. "Between jobs, mostly." Ethan leaned lightly against the window again, looking out over the skyline she had drawn so many times. "What would you do if you had more time?" he asked. The question caught Olivia off guard. She hesitated before answering. "I would probably try to turn them into something real," she said slowly. "Maybe an art show someday. But that is a long way from where I am now." Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful again. For a brief moment, the distance between their lives felt strangely visible in the quiet room. Olivia lived her days moving between buses, cleaning shifts, and evening work at the cafe, while Ethan managed a global company from offices overlooking the river. Yet somehow the conversation between them felt natural, almost as if they were standing on equal ground for a moment inside the quiet penthouse. Ethan glanced once more at the skyline beyond the glass before turning back toward her. "Sometimes distance is not measured by where you start," he said calmly. "Sometimes it is measured by how clearly you see where you want to go." Olivia did not fully understand why those words stayed with her as she gathered her cleaning supplies again. But as she prepared to finish her final task before leaving, she had the quiet feeling that something important had just been placed gently into motion. Olivia Hayes moved quietly through the final room on her checklist, finishing the last details of the cleaning routine with the same careful focus she always brought to her work. The bedroom windows overlooked the wide stretch of Lake Michigan, where gray clouds drifted slowly across the horizon and soft winter light reflected across the water. She wiped the dresser surface and adjusted a decorative frame slightly to the left, making sure everything looked exactly as it had when she arrived. Behind her, the penthouse remained calm and silent, the distant hum of the city far below barely reaching the quiet height of the tower. For a moment, she paused near the window, looking out at the skyline she had drawn so many times in her sketchbook. Somehow the view felt different now, as if the conversation earlier had changed the way she looked at it. In the living room, Ethan Carter remained near the tall glass wall, watching the quiet reflection of the city across the river. The morning had passed differently than he expected. He had originally planned to spend only a few minutes in the apartment before returning to his office downtown. Yet the quiet conversation with Olivia had shifted something in the rhythm of the day. He had spent years surrounded by ambitious voices, negotiations, and constant pressure to move faster, build bigger, expand further. Standing here now, listening to the quiet sounds of someone simply finishing their work, felt strangely grounding. A few minutes later, Olivia stepped back into the living room, carrying her tote bag and folded cloths. "I believe everything is finished," she said politely. Ethan turned from the window. "Thank you," he replied. She nodded once and walked toward the entryway, slipping the sketchbook carefully back into her bag before reaching for her jacket. Normally, she would leave quickly, just another worker finishing another routine job. But as she stepped toward the door, Ethan spoke again. "Olivia." She turned slightly, surprised to hear her name once more. Ethan walked toward the kitchen counter and picked up a small business card resting beside his tablet. He handed it to her calmly. The card was simple and white, printed with clean black lettering. Ethan Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Carter Dynamics. Olivia looked down at the card and then back at him, her expression shifting slightly as the realization connected the name to the towering glass building she passed every morning on the bus. She had seen the company logo countless times across downtown Chicago. "I did not realize," she began quietly. Ethan gave a small shrug. "It does not change the conversation we had," he said calmly. Olivia nodded slowly, still absorbing the information. Ethan continued, his tone steady and thoughtful. "If you ever decide to show those drawings somewhere beyond that sketchbook, call the number on that card." Olivia looked at the card again, uncertain whether to treat the offer as serious or simply polite encouragement. "Why would you help someone you just met?" she asked honestly. Ethan glanced once more toward the skyline beyond the glass walls. "Because sometimes the city hides talent in places people forget to look," he replied. Olivia slipped the card carefully into the inside pocket of her bag, still unsure what to think. "Thank you," she said softly. She stepped out into the quiet hallway and the door closed gently behind her. Inside the penthouse, Ethan returned to the window, watching the small figure of the city moving far below. Somewhere in that endless grid of streets, Olivia Hayes would soon disappear back into her routine of buses, cafes, and late-night sketches. But the small white card now resting in her bag carried a possibility neither of them had fully expected. 3 weeks passed before Olivia Hayes finally gathered the courage to look at the white business card again. It had stayed quietly inside the small pocket of her bag the entire time, resting beside her sketchbook while her life continued exactly as it always had. Early buses, long cleaning shifts, evening hours serving coffee behind the counter of the cafe on Wabash Avenue. Every night when she returned to her tiny apartment, she would sometimes take the card out and read the name again under the soft yellow light of her desk lamp. Ethan Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Carter Dynamics. The name belonged to a world that still felt impossibly distant from hers. Yet the conversation inside the quiet penthouse kept returning to her thoughts, Sometimes the city hides talent in places people forget to look. One cold Thursday evening after finishing her cafe shift, Olivia sat at the small table by her apartment window with her sketchbook open beside her. Outside, Chicago glowed under the early winter darkness, streetlights reflecting across wet pavement as cars moved slowly through the intersections. She turned the page and looked again at the drawings she had spent years filling quietly between jobs. River reflections, bus stops, narrow cafes glowing under rain. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what it might mean to show them somewhere beyond these pages. Her hand moved slowly toward the phone on the table. For a long moment she hesitated, staring at the number printed on the card. Then she dialed it. Across the river in the tall glass headquarters of Carter Dynamics, Ethan Carter was reviewing a presentation with two members of his executive team when his assistant stepped quietly into the office doorway. She approached his desk and placed a small note beside his tablet. "Someone named Olivia Hayes is on the line," she said softly. Ethan paused for only a second before picking up the phone. "Olivia," he said calmly once the line connected. On the other side of the call, she felt a brief wave of nervousness before answering. "I hope I am not calling at a bad time," she said carefully. Ethan glanced toward the dark skyline beyond the office windows. "Not at all," he replied. "I was hoping you might call." The following month, a small art gallery along the Chicago River opened an evening exhibition called City Corners. Inside the softly lit room, framed drawings of familiar streets, bridges, and quiet cafes lined the white walls. Guests moved slowly between the displays, studying the careful pencil details of a city they thought they already knew. Near the center of the room, Olivia Hayes stood quietly, still adjusting to the idea that the drawings she once carried inside a worn sketchbook were now hanging in frames beneath gallery lights. Across the room, Ethan Carter spoke with the gallery curator before stepping back to observe the quiet crowd gathering around the artwork. He did not interrupt Olivia as people approached to ask questions about the sketches. Instead, he watched the same thoughtful attention he had noticed in the penthouse now appearing in the faces of strangers discovering her work for the first time. Later that evening, Olivia stepped outside onto the Riverwalk balcony beside the gallery. The Chicago skyline stretched across the water exactly the way she had drawn it so many times before. Ethan joined her quietly after a moment. "You were right," he said calmly, looking at the reflections on the river. "The city really does change every hour." Olivia smiled softly. "That is why I keep drawing it," she replied. For a moment, they both looked out across the glowing skyline in comfortable silence. Two lives that had once existed in completely separate worlds now standing side by side beneath the lights of the same city. In the heart of Chicago, a quiet moment captured by a penthouse security alert begins an unexpected journey between two completely different lives. When a hardworking young woman enters the luxury apartment, believing it is empty, she has no idea that the billionaire owner is briefly alerted by the security system and immediately turns the camera away out of respect. Yet that single moment stays in his mind and sparks a curiosity that will quietly connect their worlds. This emotional narrative follows the life of a powerful billionaire CEO whose days are filled with boardrooms and global decisions, and a determined young artist who works long hours cleaning apartments and serving coffee while secretly filling a worn sketchbook with drawings of the city she loves. As their paths cross inside the silent penthouse, a simple accident reveals her hidden talent, and the billionaire begins to see something most people overlook. A rare perspective on the beauty of everyday city life. What follows is a heartfelt journey of opportunity, quiet encouragement, and unexpected transformation as the young woman slowly gains the confidence to share her art with the world, while the billionaire discovers that success is not only measured in wealth, but also in recognizing the dreams hidden within ordinary lives. This inspiring cinematic story captures the emotional depth that fans of millionaire stories love, showing how kindness, respect, and belief in someone's talent can change the direction of a life. Viewers who enjoy powerful millionaire stories about unlikely connections between wealth and humility will find themselves drawn into the gentle drama of this encounter. Set against the glowing skyline of Chicago, the narrative explores the contrast between luxury penthouses and crowded city buses, while reminding audiences why millionaire stories often resonate so strongly with people searching for hope and inspiration. Through quiet conversations and life-changing opportunities, this story reflects the emotional heart found in the most memorable millionaire stories where success meets compassion. Ultimately, the meeting between a billionaire and a hardworking dreamer becomes a moving example of how unexpected moments can open doors to new futures, proving once again why stories like these continue to captivate audiences who love meaningful millionaire stories about destiny, kindness, and the courage to follow a dream. Character 135-year-old white billionaire CEO man. Confident professional appearance. Tailored charcoal business suit. Crisp white shirt. Subtle luxury watch. Neat short dark hair. Calm intelligent expression. Front-facing portrait. Realistic lighting. Cinematic realism. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Professional photography style. Character 224-year-old white young woman. Hardworking city artist, soft natural face, expressive thoughtful eyes, simple casual work clothes. With light jacket, dark hair loosely tied back, front-facing portrait, realistic lighting, cinematic realism. No cartoon, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.